September 17th, 1944, 5:43 a.m., Belgian-German border. 50 yards from the Siegfried Line, Sergeant Frank Delaney lay flat behind a shattered stone wall, his Springfield rifle pressed tight against his shoulder, watching a German machine gun crew set up their position 300 yards downslope. The fog was thick gray, clinging to ground like a shroud, but through a scope Delaney could see them clearly. For men moving with the practiced efficiency of veterans, positioning the MG-42 to cover the narrow road that ran through the valley. That road was the only approach route into the sector. If the machine gun opened fire, it would cut down an entire American company advancing in column. Delaney's orders were simple: hold this position, observe enemy movements, and report back. But his radio was dead, smashed by artillery fire 2 hours earlier. His squad was gone, scattered or dead. And in less than 10 minutes, American infantry would march straight into that machine gun's field of fire. Delaney exhaled slowly, steadied his breathing, centered the crosshairs on the gunner's chest, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The German fell. And the longest 36 hours of Frank Delaney's life began. Frank Delaney was 28 years old, older than most sergeants in his battalion. A quiet, precise man from rural Montana who had grown up hunting deer and elk in the mountains. He could shoot a moving target at 400 yards with open sights, read wind and terrain instinctively, and move through forests without making a sound. He enlisted in 1942, not out of patriotism or rage, but because his younger brother had been killed at Kasserine Pass and someone had to finish what he started. Delaney was assigned to the 28th Infantry Division and deployed to Europe in July 1944, landing in Normandy 3 weeks after D-Day. By September, the division was pushing toward the German border, part of the massive Allied advance that had liberated France, and was now grinding against the fortified defenses of the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line was not a single wall, but a network of bunkers, Dragon's Teeth tank obstacles, minefields, and interlocking firing positions stretching for hundreds of miles along Germany's western frontier. Breaking through required patience, firepower, and blood. Delaney's battalion was tasked with clearing a narrow corridor through a forested valley, a route that intelligence reported as lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong. On the night of September 16th, Delaney's squad was sent forward as part of a reconnaissance patrol to confirm the route was clear before the main advance. They moved the forest in the pre-dawn darkness. 12 men spread out in a loose formation, weapons ready, every sense tuned to the shadows. Delaney led the patrol, his rifle slung across his back, a pistol in his hand. Moving carefully through the underbrush, they reached a low ridge overlooking the valley at 4 a.m. and took up positions to observe. Below them, in the gray light before sunrise, they could see the road, the forest beyond it, and the faint outline of fortifications dug into the hillside. Delaney used his binoculars to scan the area, noting troop movements, defensive positions, and a machine gun nest that dominated the approach. He was preparing to send a runner back with the information when German artillery opened fire. The shells came without warning, a sudden, devastating barrage that tore through the forest, exploding in bursts of fire and shrapnel. Delaney dug behind a fallen tree, pressed himself flat, and felt the ground shake beneath him. The barrage lasted 3 minutes, but felt like hours. When it stopped, Delaney lifted his head and looked around. 5 men were dead. 3 were wounded. The rest were scattered, separated by the smoke and chaos. Delaney's radio operator was dead. The radio destroyed. They were cut off. Delaney regrouped the survivors, for men including himself, and assessed the situation. They were isolated behind enemy lines, with no communication and no clear way back. The German positions were now fully alert, reinforced, and between them and the American lines. Delaney made the decision quickly. They would stay on the ridge, observe enemy movements, and try to disrupt German operations until they could link up with the main force. It was not a plan. It was survival. He positioned the 4 men in a defensive line along the ridge, spacing them out to cover the maximum area, and took the central position himself, the one with the clearest view of the road and the machine gun nest. At 5:30 a.m., he saw a movement below. German infantry, at least 30 men, moving in column along the road, heading toward the American positions. Behind them, supply trucks, and a half-track. Delaney knew what was coming. This was a counterattack, or the preparation for one. If those troops reached the American lines unimpeded, they would hit the advancing company from an unexpected angle, inflict heavy casualties, and possibly collapse the entire advance. Delaney had no radio. He had no way to warn anyone. All he had was his rifle. At 5:43 a.m., Delaney took his first shot. The German machine gunner dropped, killed instantly. The other 3 crew members froze, looking around in confusion, trying to locate the shooter. Delaney fired again, hitting the assistant gunner in the shoulder. The man fell, screaming. The remaining 2 Germans dove for cover, abandoning the machine gun. The column on the road stopped, soldiers scattering into tree line, shouting orders, trying to organize. Delaney shifted his aim, targeted an officer pointing and giving commands, and fired. The officer fell. Panic rippled through the German troops. They did not know where the shots were coming from. The fog obscured Delaney's position, and the sound of the rifle echoed off the valley walls, making it impossible to pinpoint. Delaney reloaded, chambered another round, and kept firing. He aimed for leaders, for soldiers carrying radios, for anyone trying to organize a response. He fired methodically, 1 shot every 30 seconds, giving himself time to aim, to account for wind and distance, to ensure each shot mattered. By 6 a.m., he had fired 12 rounds and hit 11 targets. The German column had retreated into the forest, pinned down, unable to advance. The road was clear, but the Germans knew someone was up on that ridge. By 6:30 a.m., mortar fire began falling on Delaney's position. The rounds came in clusters, exploding in the trees, sending shrapnel and splinters through the air. Delaney and his men pressed themselves into shallow depressions, covered their heads, and waited for the barrage to pass. One of the men, a private named Ellis, was hit by a fragment that tore through his leg. Delaney crawled over, applied a tourniquet, and told Ellis to stay down. The mortar stopped after 10 minutes, and Delaney returned to his position. Below, German troops were moving again, trying a different approach, advancing through the forest on the left flank. Delaney tracked them through his scope, waited until they emerged into a clearing, and fired. He dropped the lead man, then the second, then shifted and fired into the group behind them. The advance stalled. The Germans pulled back. Delaney reloaded. His hands were steady. His breathing was calm. He had entered the zone, that strange focused state where time slows, where fear recedes, where there's only the target, the trigger, and the shot. He had been in this state before, hunting elk in Montana, tracking a wounded animal through the snow. He knew how to stay in it, how to let instinct guide him, how to trust his training, and he knew he could not stop. If he stopped, the Germans would advance. If they advanced, American soldiers would die. By noon, Delaney had been firing for 6 hours. He had taken 43 shots and hit 38 targets. His shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil. His eyes burned from staring through the scope. His throat was dry, his canteen empty, his rations gone. But the road remained clear. Every time the Germans tried to move troops or supplies through the valley, Delaney stopped them. He did not need to kill every soldier. He just needed to make movement impossible, to create the perception that the ridge was held by a much larger force, to force the Germans to commit resources to neutralizing a threat that was only one man. And it worked. German commanders, unable to see Delaney's position clearly, assumed they were facing a sniper team or a squad of sharpshooters. They called in artillery, sent patrols to flank the ridge, and pulled troops from other sectors to deal with the problem. All of that took time, resources, and attention away from the main American advance. At 1 p.m., Delaney saw American infantry moving up the road from the opposite direction, the main company finally arriving. He wanted to signal them, to let them know he was friendly, but he could not risk exposing his position. He watched as they advanced cautiously, encountered no resistance, and secured the valley. The German troops, still pinned down and disorganized, withdrew without engaging. The road was open. The advance continued. But Delaney was not done. German forces regrouped that afternoon, pulling back to secondary positions and preparing for a counterattack the following morning. Delaney, watching through a scope, saw trucks moving, troops repositioning, officers conferring over maps. He knew what was coming. They would hit the American positions at dawn, trying to retake the valley and cut off the advance. Delaney's commanding officer, if he had been able to communicate, would have ordered him to withdraw, to link up with the main force, to get off the ridge before he was overrun. But Delaney had no communication. He had no orders. He had only his instinct, and his instinct told him to stay. The ridge gave him elevation, visibility, and a clear field of fire. If he stayed, he could disrupt the counterattack before it began. If he left, the Germans would have a free hand. So he stayed. That night, Delaney and his 3 remaining men dug shallow foxholes, rationed the last of their water, and prepared for another day. Private Ellis, the wounded man, was feverish and in pain, but stable. Delaney told the others to get what sleep they could. He would take the first watch. At 5:15 a.m. on September 18th, the German counterattack began. Delaney saw them forming up in the pre-dawn darkness. 3 companies of infantry, supported by 2 armored cars and a self-propelled gun. It was a serious force, more than enough to overrun the American positions in the valley if they achieved surprise. Delaney did not let them achieve surprise. He opened fire at 5:30 a.m., targeting the officers first, then the radio operators, then the soldiers clustering around the armored vehicles. His rifle cracked again and again, each shot deliberate, each shot precise. The Germans, caught in the open, scrambled for cover. The advance stalled. The armored vehicles, unwilling to proceed without infantry support, held their positions. Delaney kept firing. He knew he could not stop the entire counterattack alone, but he could slow it, disrupt it, force the Germans to waste time reorganizing. And time was what the American forces needed. By 6 a.m., American artillery, now aware of the German buildup, began falling on the assembly area. Shells screamed overhead, exploding among the German troops, scattering them, destroying vehicles, turning the counterattack into chaos. The Germans pulled back, and the attack collapsed before it truly began. Delaney lowered his rifle, exhausted, and realized he was shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. He had been awake for 30 hours, firing almost continuously, surviving on adrenaline and willpower. At 7 a.m., an American patrol reached the ridge. They climbed cautiously, weapons ready, expecting to find a fortified position held by a platoon or more. Instead, they found 4 men, 3 privates and 1 sergeant, all filthy, exhausted, and out of ammunition. The patrol leader, a lieutenant named Harris, stared at Delaney in disbelief. "You've been holding this ridge alone?" Delaney nodded. "Yes, sir." Harris looked down at the valley, at the scattered German positions, at the bodies visible through the fog. "How many?" Delaney thought for a moment. "I stopped counting after 40. Harris called for a medic, for water, for reinforcements. Delaney was evacuated off the ridge at 8 a.m., along with the wounded private and the other survivors. As they descended, Delaney looked back at the position he had held for 36 hours. It was just a pile of rocks and shattered trees. Nothing special, nothing defensible by doctrine or training. But it had been enough. It had been the right place at the right time, and he had made it count. That was all that mattered. Delaney was taken to a field hospital, treated for dehydration and exhaustion, and held for observation. His commanding officer, Major William Grant, visited him the next day. Grant sat on the edge of Delaney's cot, shook his head, and said, "You know, you were supposed to pull back when your radio was destroyed." Delaney nodded. "Yes, sir. I know." Grant smiled faintly. "So why didn't you?" Delaney thought for a long time before answering. "Because if I pulled back, Germans would have used that road. Our guys would have walked into an ambush. I couldn't let that happen." Grant nodded slowly. "You held that ridge for 36 hours. You fired over 100 rounds. Intelligence counted 48 confirmed German casualties, all attributed to you. You disrupted 2 major enemy operations and saved an entire company from walking into a trap. Do you understand what that means?" Delaney shrugged. "I did my job, sir." Grant shook his head. "No, Sergeant. You did a hell of a lot more than that." Grant submitted a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. The recommendation was approved in November 1944, and Delaney received the medal in a ceremony in Belgium. Standing in the rain, feeling nothing but relief that it was over, Delaney returned to combat in December 1944, participating in the Battle of the Bulge and the final push into Germany. He survived the war without serious injury and was discharged in October 1945. He returned to Montana, bought a small ranch with his discharge pay, and spent the next 40 years raising cattle and living quietly. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked, he would say he had been a rifleman and leave it at that. He did not mention the Ridge, the 36 hours, or the 48 Germans. It was not shame that kept him silent. It was simply that he did not think of it as extraordinary. He had done what needed to be done with the tools he had, in the situation he found himself in. That was all. In 1952, a journalist writing a book about the 28th Infantry Division interviewed Delaney, asking for details about his actions in September 1944. Delaney described the events briefly, factually, without emotion. The journalist pressed for more color, more drama, more insight into what he had been thinking and feeling. Delaney shrugged. I was trying not to die, and I was trying to keep other guys from dying. That's all there was to it. The journalist published a chapter about Delaney titled The Rifleman of the Ridge. It was read by a few thousand people and then forgotten. Delaney married in 1948, a schoolteacher from a neighboring town, and raised 3 children. He taught his sons to hunt, to shoot, to respect the land and the animals they pursued. He never taught them to kill people. He never talked about the mechanics of sniping or the psychology of taking a human life. When his oldest son asked him what the war had been like, Delaney said, "Loud, dirty, and sad. I'm glad you'll never have to know." That son, Michael, was drafted during the Vietnam War, but never saw combat. He returned home safely, and Delaney was grateful. In 1978, Delaney's wife died of cancer. He spent the next decade alone on the ranch, working the land, reading, and thinking about the life he had lived. He thought about the Ridge, occasionally, late at night when sleep would not come. He thought about the men he had killed, faceless shapes through a scope, and wondered if they had families, children, lives they wanted to return to. He did not feel guilt. Exactly. He had been a soldier, doing a soldier's job in a war he did not start. But he felt a sadness, a recognition that those 48 deaths, necessary as they might have been, were still tragedies. 48 men who would never go home. 48 families who would grieve. War was not glorious. It was just loss, multiplied and repeated until the numbers stopped meaning anything. In 1985, a military historian researching sniper tactics in World War II contacted Delaney, asking for an interview. Delaney was 70 years old, still living on the ranch, still healthy and sharp. He agreed to meet. The historian, a young professor named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, arrived with a tape recorder, a notebook, and a dozen questions. Delaney answered them all patiently, describing the ridge, the shots, the terrain, the conditions. Dr. Mitchell asked him how he had maintained accuracy over such a long period, how he had managed fear and exhaustion, how he had made decisions without communication or orders. Delaney thought carefully before answering. I grew up hunting. My father taught me that every shot matters, that you don't waste ammunition, that you respect the animal you're hunting. I applied the same principles in the war. I didn't think of the Germans as targets or enemies. I thought of them as problems that needed solving. If I could solve the problem with 1 shot, that was better than 10 shots. If I could solve it without shooting at all, that was even better. But on that ridge, shooting was the only solution I had. Dr. Mitchell asked if he regretted any of it. Delaney was silent for a long time. I regret the war. I regret that it was necessary. But I don't regret what I did on that ridge. If I hadn't been there, a lot of American soldiers would have died. I chose to save them. I'd make the same choice again. Dr. Mitchell published her findings in a 1987 paper titled Sustained Engagement, the case of Sergeant Frank Delaney and the tactical value of individual marksmanship. The paper analyzed Delaney's actions from a military perspective, examining how a single rifleman, properly positioned and trained, could exert disproportionate influence on a tactical situation. The paper was well received in military academic circles and led to renewed interest in sniper training and the role of precision marksmanship in modern warfare. Delaney did not read the paper. He did not care about academic analysis or tactical theory. He had lived it. That was enough. In 1990, Delaney was invited to speak at the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning, Georgia. He declined at first, saying he was too old, too far removed from the modern military. But the school commandant, a colonel who had read Dr. Mitchell's paper, insisted. The students need to hear from someone who actually did it, not just studied it. Delaney agreed. He flew to Georgia, stood in front of a classroom of young soldiers, and told them about the ridge. He described the conditions, the decisions, the shots. He emphasized patience, discipline, and respect for the weapon and the target. He told them that sniping was not about glory or heroism. It was about solving problems, protecting lives, and making every shot count. The students listened in silence. When he finished, one of them asked, "What's the most important lesson you learned?" Delaney thought for a moment that you can't control the situation. You can only control yourself. Stay calm, trust your training, and do the job in front of you. Everything else is noise. Delaney died in 1994 at the age of 78. He passed away quietly in his sleep, alone on the ranch he had worked for nearly 50 years. His funeral was attended by his children, his grandchildren, a handful of neighbors, and 3 Army officers in dress uniforms. One of the officers was Dr. Mitchell, who had stayed in contact with Delaney over the years and considered him a friend. At the funeral, she spoke briefly about his contributions to military history and his impact on sniper training. She described him as a humble man who had done extraordinary things without seeking recognition. After the service, Delaney's children found a box in his study containing his medals, his discharge papers, and a small leather-bound journal. The journal contained entries from the war, brief notes about missions, movements, and losses. One entry, dated September 18, 1944, read, "Held the ridge. Lost count of shots. Germans pulled back. We survived. That's all that matters." The children donated the journal and medals to the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, where they were placed in an exhibit on individual valor. The exhibit included a photograph of Delaney in uniform, his rifle across his lap, his eyes distant and serious. Below the photograph, a placard described his actions on the ridge and quoted his words to the sniper students. "Stay calm, trust your training, and do the job in front of you." Today, Delaney's story is taught at the Army Sniper School as part of a module on sustained engagement and independent action. Instructors use his experience to illustrate the importance of marksmanship, patience, and decision-making under pressure. Students study the terrain, the distances, the conditions, and the psychological challenges of operating alone for extended periods. They learn that Delaney did not win because he was superhuman or invincible. He won because he was disciplined, prepared, and willing to stay when others would have retreated. That lesson is as relevant today as it was in 1944. Modern snipers, operating in urban environments or remote terrain, face similar challenges: isolation, limited resources, and the need to make life or death decisions without immediate support. Delaney's example provides a framework for how to approach those situations with professionalism and effectiveness. In 2008, a documentary filmmaker producing a series on World War II snipers contacted the National Infantry Museum, asking for stories that had been overlooked. The museum staff recommended Delaney. The filmmaker researched his service, interviewed Dr. Mitchell, and produced a 20-minute segment that aired as part of a larger documentary. The segment was titled "The Ridge." It told Delaney's story using archival footage, maps, and interviews with military historians. It was watched by an estimated 2 million people. Among those viewers was a young Army specialist named David Torres, who was training to become a sniper. Torres was struck by Delaney's story, not because of the numbers or the duration, but because of the quiet determination, the refusal to abandon the mission even when every rational calculation said it was hopeless. Torres printed a photograph of Delaney from the documentary, folded it, and carried it in his pocket through sniper school. When he graduated, he was assigned to a unit deploying to Afghanistan. Over the next 3 years, Torres participated in dozens of missions, many of which required patience, discipline, and the ability to operate alone. He thought about Delaney often, especially during long, tense hours on Overwatch, waiting for a target, managing fear and exhaustion. Delaney's example reminded him that the job was not about glory or excitement. It was about protecting lives and doing the work that needed to be done. Torres survived his deployment and returned home safely. He later became an instructor at the sniper school, where he told Delaney's story to new students, passing the lesson forward to another generation. That is the true measure of Delaney's legacy, not the medals or the exhibits or the documentaries, but the lives shaped by his example, the soldiers who learned from his experience, and the knowledge that one man, alone on a ridge, can make a difference. Frank Delaney did not set out to be a hero. He set out to do his job, to hold a position, to protect his fellow soldiers. He did not think about records or recognition. He thought about the next shot, the next target, the next decision. And in doing so, he became exactly what the Army needed him to be, a soldier who could be trusted to stay, to fight, and to win against impossible odds. His story is not about superhuman skill or invincibility. It is about discipline, preparation, and the willingness to endure. It is about making every shot count, trusting your training, and refusing to quit even when the situation seems hopeless. Those lessons are timeless. They apply not just to soldiers, but to anyone facing a difficult challenge, a moment of crisis, or a decision that requires courage and clarity. Delaney faced such a moment on a foggy ridge in Belgium, and he chose to stay. That choice saved lives, changed the outcome of a battle, and became a story that would outlive him, not because he sought fame, but because he did what was necessary when it was necessary without hesitation or doubt. That is heroism. That is sacrifice. That is the story of Frank Delaney. Subscribe for more stories like this. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below.